The peonies were white. The champagne was chilled, and the string quartet played a haunting melody that echoed through a half-empty room. I stood at the back of the church, clutching my bouquet until my knuckles turned white, staring at two vacant chairs in the front row. My parents weren't coming. They weren't in a car wreck. They weren't in the hospital. They were 3 miles away, blowing out candles on my 30-year-old brother's birthday cake, a man-child who had never held a job, yet held their hearts captive. In that moment, the girl who always understood finally died. The daughter who paid their mortgage and fixed their messes vanished. But this isn't just a story about a ruined wedding. It's about what happened 6 months later when the silence was shattered by a sobbing phone call. My mother didn't call to apologize for the wedding. She called because they were drowning in a $30,000 debt only I could pay. They thought I was still the reliable one. They thought my bank account was their safety net. They were wrong. What follows is a journey of calculated silence and a truth so dark it involves a betrayal deeper than a missed ceremony. If you've ever felt like the invisible child or been told that family comes first, only when it benefits someone else, you need to hear this. Stay with me until the final sentence, because the way I looked them in the eye and dismantled their world dollar by dollar will give you the most satisfying payoff you've ever witnessed. This isn't just revenge. It's a masterclass in setting a bridge on fire and watching it burn from the right side of the river. My name is Morgan, and at 32 I had built a life defined by precision and reliability. As a senior project manager for a top-tier architectural firm in Chicago, my entire world revolved around deadlines, structural integrity, and ensuring that every moving part of a complex system functioned perfectly. I was the person everyone leaned on, the one who caught the mistakes others missed, and the daughter who had quietly stabilized her family's crumbling finances for a decade without ever being asked to be thanked. The morning of my wedding was supposed to be the one day where the architecture of my life wasn't about supporting everyone else, but about celebrating a foundation I had built for myself. Every detail of the garden ceremony was a testament to that effort. The scent of white peonies was thick in the humid June air, mingling with the expensive woody notes of the perfume I had chosen for the occasion. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner of the terrace, the notes crisp and elegant against the soft chatter of 90 guests. It was a setting of absolute perfection, curated to be the happiest day of my life. Yet as the time for the ceremony drew near, a heavy, suffocating silence began to emanate from the very first row. 2 chairs draped in delicate white silk and positioned in the place of honor sat glaringly empty. My bridesmaids kept glancing at their phones, their smiles becoming increasingly forced as they checked the time. My father was supposed to walk me down the aisle at exactly 4:00 p.m. By 4:15 p.m., the whispers among the guests had begun to shift from admiration of the decor to a low, buzzing pity. Just as the coordinator was about to signal the music to change, a courier in a sweat-stained uniform approached the bridal suite. He didn't have a bouquet or a telegram of congratulations. He handed me a small, weathered wooden box that looked like it had been sitting in the back of a junk drawer for years. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it, expecting a family heirloom, or perhaps a last-minute note explaining a flat tire or a sudden illness. Instead, nestled in yellowed cotton was my father's vintage gold watch. It was a beautiful piece, but when I looked at the face, the second hand was motionless. It had stopped at 10:15 a.m. Underneath the watch was a scrap of notebook paper with my father's familiar hurried scrawl. It read, "Battery died, lost track of time. We're in the middle of Brandon's birthday lunch, and he's finally opening up about his new business idea. We can't leave now. Happy for you, Morgan." There was no explosion of tears. There was no dramatic collapsing onto the fainting couch. Instead, I felt a sensation of cold clarity wash over me, a chilling realization that settled into my bones like frost. I looked at that dead watch and realized it was the most honest gift my parents had ever given me. For years, I had been the one winding them up, fixing their mistakes, and keeping their lives ticking along. But for my wedding, they couldn't even be bothered to spend $5.10 at a mall kiosk to change a battery. They hadn't lost track of time. They had simply decided that my life's milestone was less important than a lunch for my brother, a man who had spent his entire life failing while they applauded his efforts. I felt my bridesmaids' eyes on me, wet with a pity I didn't want. They reached out to touch my shoulders, murmuring platitudes about how they must have just gotten confused, or maybe they'll still make the reception. I ignored them. With steady hands, I strapped the dead watch onto my own wrist. It felt heavy and cold against my skin, a silent, ticking-less monument to my family's true priorities. I wasn't wearing it out of love. I was wearing it as a measurement of the distance between us. When the quartet finally struck the opening chords of the processional, I didn't wait for a surrogate to step in. I didn't ask my father-in-law or a family friend to fill the void. I stepped out onto the grass alone. As I walked down that long, flower-lined aisle, I watched the faces of the guests. I saw the way their expressions crumpled when they realized no one was walking beside me. I saw my mother's sister turn her head away, unable to meet my eyes. My parents hadn't just missed a ceremony. They had used their absence to publicly announce my insignificance to the world. They had signaled to everyone we knew that the strong daughter, the one who bought their car and paid for their shingles vaccine, was actually the one who mattered the least. For years, I had been the invisible girl, the self-sustaining appliance that never needed maintenance. I was the one who was too successful to need a hug, too stable to need a phone call, and too together to deserve a father's arm on my wedding day. Every step I took toward the altar felt like I was shedding a layer of a skin that no longer fit. The humiliation should have burned, but instead it fueled a newfound resolve. By the time I reached the man I loved, the woman who would have forgiven them was gone. Standing at the altar, I didn't feel like a bride who had lost her parents. I felt like a woman who had finally found the exit. As the rings were exchanged and the reception blurred into a whirlwind of polite smiles and sympathetic whispers, the weight of the dead watch on my wrist became a physical anchor pulling me back through the decades of my life. I realized that my parents' absence wasn't a freak accident or a sudden lapse in judgment. It was the logical conclusion to a story they had been writing since the day I was born. Growing up, I was never allowed to be a child. I was groomed to be a pillar. While other little girls were playing house, I was the one actually helping my mother balance the checkbook or calming my father down after a bad day at work. My brother Brandon was 18 months older, but in the eyes of my parents, he was eternally 5. He was delicate, sensitive, and misunderstood, labels that acted as a permanent hall pass for every failure he ever orchestrated. I, on the other hand, was the strong one, a title that I used to wear with pride until I realized it was actually a life sentence of unpaid labor. The capable one trap was a subtle, suffocating cage. I remember winning the regional science fair at 14, beaming as I showed my parents the blue ribbon. My mother glanced at it for 3 seconds before sighing and asking if I could help Brandon with his history essay because he was just too overwhelmed by the dates. My successes were never celebrated as individual achievements. They were viewed as evidence that I didn't need anything from them, which in turn gave them permission to divert all their emotional and financial resources to Brandon. Every promotion I earned in my 20s followed the same script. When I called to tell them I'd been made a senior project manager, my father didn't ask about my new responsibilities or my salary. He waited for a beat of silence and then said, "That's great, honey. You've always been so lucky. Since you'll be making more now, do you think you could help Brandon with his back rent? He's just in a bit of a slump." My hard work wasn't a source of pride for them. It was simply a larger safety net for my brother to fall into. Over time, I became the family's chief operating officer. I was the fixer who spent my lunch breaks on the phone with their insurance companies, the one who spent my weekends filing their taxes, and the one who navigated the complex web of my mother's chronic health scares while Brandon was out finding himself at music festivals or failed retreats. I realized that my parents didn't love me for the person I was. The woman who loved old jazz, the architect who obsessed over structural integrity, the friend who loved to cook. They loved me for my utility. I was a Swiss Army knife they kept in their pocket, only remembered when something needed to be cut or screwed back together. The praise they showered on me was always transactional. "We don't know what we'd do without you, Morgan," they would say, and for years I took it as a compliment. Now I see it as a warning. It was a chain disguised as a bouquet, a way to ensure I would never stop providing the emotional and financial scaffolding that kept their world from collapsing. The shadow cast by the golden child was long and cold. Brandon was always about to make it big. He had a carousel of business ideas: organic beard oil, a cryptocurrency app, a boutique travel agency for pets, and each one was treated by my parents like a holy mission. They poured their modest savings into his whims, and when those whims inevitably evaporated, they looked to me to replenish the coffers. I eventually understood that their obsession with Brandon wasn't actually about him. It was about their own egos. Brandon was a project that was never finished, a way for them to remain needed well into their senior years. Because he was a perpetual mess, they got to be perpetual rescuers. Because I was independent and successful, I made them feel redundant. In their twisted logic, my competence was an insult to their parenting, while Brandon's incompetence was a canvas for their supposed devotion. I had become useless to their sense of self because I didn't need them to save me. Consequently, they began to erase me from the family narrative entirely, like a background character in a play where Brandon was the only one allowed to have a spotlight. The psychological toll of being the glass child, the one everyone looks right through because you're not making any trouble, was a slow-acting poison. I spent my life overperforming, thinking that if I just did a little more, worked a little harder, or saved them one more time, they would finally look at me with the same frantic adoration they gave to my brother. I thought that by being the architect of their joy, I would eventually be allowed to live inside the house I was building. I believed that my reliability was an insurance policy against abandonment. I was wrong. My wedding day proved that you can spend your whole life being the foundation, the walls, and the roof for people who will still leave you out in the rain the moment they find a more interesting party to attend. I stood there in my white dress, surrounded by people who loved me, yet feeling a profound, echoing emptiness where my family should have been. I had spent 30 years building a house for them to live in, never realizing I was the only one standing outside in the cold. The cold realization that I had been locked out of my own family's heart didn't spark a fire in me. It triggered a deep systemic freeze. I returned from my honeymoon not with the glow of a new bride, but with the calculated stillness of a scientist, beginning a grim experiment. I decided right then that I would no longer be the architect of their comfort, or the silent engine that kept their lives from stalling. This wasn't a tantrum, nor was it a dramatic declaration of no contact. It was something far more surgical. I called it my passive experiment. I simply stopped. I stopped the weekly calls to remind my mother to take her blood pressure medication. I stopped logging into my father's online banking to ensure his property taxes were paid on time. I stopped the "just checking in" texts that were usually met with one-word answers or requests for favors. I retreated into the shadows of my own life, becoming a ghost in their digital world, waiting to see if they would notice the sudden lack of haunting. I wanted to know if my presence mattered, or if I was merely a service they had grown accustomed to receiving for free. The weeks that followed were defined by a deceptive, haunting silence that felt like a slow-motion car crash. My phone, which used to buzz with their constant emergencies, the broken dishwasher, the confusing insurance form, the latest drama with the neighbors, went quiet. But the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the noise of their lives continuing without me. Because I remained in the family group chat, I became a silent observer of a world that didn't seem to miss me at all. The screen would light up with photos of Brandon's new car, a sleek silver SUV that I knew for a fact he couldn't afford on his freelance consulting income. I watched videos of Sunday dinners at my parents' house, the very house I had paid to have re-roofed 2 years ago, where laughter echoed over wine and roast beef. I saw the empty chair where I used to sit, now occupied by Brandon's latest girlfriend or a stack of mail. They weren't angry at me for my silence. They were simply indifferent to it. As long as I wasn't there to demand accountability or remind them of my own needs, I was a non-entity. This was the most painful validation of my darkest fear. I was never a daughter to them. I was a service provider. And when the service stopped, they didn't call the provider to check on her health. They just assumed the system was still running in the background until it finally broke. As the second month turned into the third, the invisible infrastructure I had built for them began to fray at the edges. My parents were people who lived in a perpetual fog of later, and I had been the one to clear the mist. Without my reminders, the small gears of their existence started to grind and seize. I knew the property tax deadline was approaching, a date I usually handled with a quick transfer of funds and a stern reminder to my father to sign the paperwork. I watched the date pass on my calendar with a heavy heart, resisting the muscle memory that screamed at me to pick up the phone. I heard through my aunt that my mother had missed her appointment with the cardiologist, the one I usually spent 3 hours coordinating to ensure it didn't clash with her bridge club. I felt a profound sense of mourning, a grief that is unique to those who watch their loved ones struggle through a self-inflicted fog. It is the loneliest kind of sorrow, grieving for people who are still alive, but who have chosen to be dead to you unless you are of use. I felt like a spectator at the demolition of my own childhood, watching the walls crumble, not because of malice, but because of a simple, staggering lack of care. The psychological weight of this experiment was nearly unbearable. Every time my phone chimed, my heart would leap with a pathetic, desperate hope that it was a text from my mother asking how I was doing, or a call from my father wanting to know about my new job. But it was always a news alert, a spam call, or a message from my husband, who watched my descent into this cold clarity with a mixture of protective rage and profound sadness. He saw me staring at the dead gold watch on my wrist, which I still wore every day as a memento mori for my relationship with my parents. I was waiting for the mask to slip, for the reality of their situation to pierce through their obsession with Brandon. I knew Brandon wouldn't help them. Brandon was a consumer of souls, not a provider of solutions. He would drive that new car right past their crumbling house without a second thought once the gas tank went empty. I was the only one who had ever truly held the line, and I was no longer standing at my post. I was learning the hard way that when you are the strong one, people don't ask how you are holding up the world. They just complain when the world starts to tilt. By the end of the third month, the atmospheric pressure of the silence had reached a breaking point. I had effectively erased myself from their narrative, and the void I left behind was finally starting to suck the oxygen out of their room. The group chat had gone quiet as the reality of their mounting small problems began to coalesce into a singular, undeniable crisis. I knew the engine was smoking, I knew the oil was gone, and the pistons were screaming. I had spent my life as the mechanic who worked in the middle of the night, so they never had to hear the engine roar, but those days were over. I sat in my quiet living room, the city lights of Chicago twinkling outside my window, feeling a strange, hollow peace. I had survived the silence. I had looked into the abyss of my family's indifference, and I hadn't blinked. I was no longer waiting for their love. I was simply waiting for the inevitable moment when their world would finally stop turning, and they would realize who had been spinning it all along. For 90 days, my phone was a graveyard of silence, until the moment the engine finally stalled and they needed a mechanic. The silence was shattered at 3 a.m, not by a realization of love, but by the shrill, frantic scream of my ringtone. It was the engine finally seizing up. When I answered, my mother's voice was a jagged mess of wet sobs and high-pitched panic, a sound designed to trigger every rescue instinct I had spent 30 years honing. She didn't ask about my marriage or why I had been silent for months. She went straight for the jugular, claiming that the family home, the craftsman house my grandfather had built with his own hands, the place where my height was still marked in pencil, on the pantry door, was in foreclosure. She spun a frantic tale of a clerical bank error and a predatory lender that had somehow bypassed all the mail I usually sorted for them. She told me they needed $30,000 by Friday, or the locks would be changed and they would be on the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Then came the masterclass in gaslighting. Her voice dropped to a whisper, trembling with a calculated accusation as she asked if I really cared so little about our family heritage. She reminded me of all they had done for me, as if the basic act of providing food and shelter in the 90s was a debt I was required to pay back with my entire future. Do you want your father to die of a heart attack from the stress, Morgan? Do you want us sleeping in a shelter while you live in your fancy Chicago condo? It was a tidal wave of emotional blackmail designed to make me feel like a monster for even hesitating. But as I sat there in the dark listening to her performative grief, the cold project manager in me took over. I knew how banks worked. I knew that foreclosure wasn't a sudden trap door that opened overnight. It was a long, documented hallway of warnings. I didn't write the check. I didn't even offer comfort. I simply told her I would look into it, and hung up. The next morning, I didn't call a lawyer. I opened my laptop and tapped into the professional databases I used for my architectural firm. I pulled the public records for my parents' property, my heart a steady rhythmic thrum of dread. As the digital documents loaded, the lie began to disintegrate in the harsh glow of the screen. The mortgage was current. There were no liens, no notices of default, and certainly no bank errors. The house was perfectly safe. My parents weren't being evicted from their home. They were being evicted from their comfort. Digging deeper into the local court dockets, I found the real monster hiding under the bed. There it was, a civil suit and a pending criminal charge against Brandon. 6 weeks ago, while driving the luxury SUV I'd seen in the group chat, a car he had no insurance for, he had plowed into a parked Mercedes in a high-end district, causing a 3-car pileup. The $30,000 wasn't for a roof or a heritage. It was a legal settlement to keep the golden boy out of a jail cell and to pay off the victims before the insurance company could sue my parents into bankruptcy for his negligence. The realization was a jagged shard of ice through the chest. My parents were willing to fabricate the loss of my grandfather's legacy to play on my deepest childhood memories and my fear for their safety, just to shield Brandon from the consequences of his own staggering stupidity. They were trying to rob me of my hard-earned savings money my husband and I were putting towards starting our own family to pay for a stranger's Mercedes that their favorite child had totaled. The betrayal wasn't just in the ask, it was in the erasure of my reality. They knew I would never give Brandon a dime for another one of his disasters, so they tried to trick me into giving it to them under the guise of an emergency. They were willing to make me believe they were homeless just to keep Brandon's record clean. In that moment, the final thread of daughterly devotion snapped. It didn't break with a bang. It simply dissolved. I looked at the gold watch on my wrist, the one that had stopped at 10:15 a.m. on my wedding day, and I realized that my parents were stuck in a permanent loop of dysfunction, where I was nothing more than an ATM with a pulse. I was the person they called to pay the bill for a life I wasn't even invited to lead. This was the point of no return. The empathy I had carried like a heavy backpack for 3 decades simply fell away, leaving behind a surgical diamond-hard resolve. I called my mother back that evening. I didn't reveal what I knew yet. I wanted to hear how far she would go. She was already talking about where I should wire the money, her voice sounding suspiciously lighter, almost celebratory. She started talking about how we would get through this and how Brandon was so stressed about their housing situation that he could barely eat. I listened to her weave this tapestry of lies, each thread a deliberate insult to my intelligence. She even had the audacity to suggest that if I gave a little more, maybe $35,000, they could do some much-needed repairs, so the house would be worth more for my future inheritance. It was a bribe paid with my own money. I realized then that they didn't see me as a person at all. I was a resource to be mined, a well to be pumped until it ran dry. My mother's tone turned sharp when I didn't immediately agree. She began to use the disappointed voice, the one that used to make me cry as a teenager. She told me I was becoming hard and selfish, and that my new life in the city had made me forget where I came from. She was trying to shame me into submission, unaware that I was standing on a mountain of evidence that proved she was the one who had forgotten what it meant to be a parent. The conversation ended when she realized I wasn't opening my wallet. The tears returned, but they were different this time, angrier, more demanding. She told me that if they lost the house, it would be on my conscience forever. She said she wouldn't be able to look at me again if I let them fail. I felt a strange sense of freedom as she spoke. Her threats had lost their power because the house she was talking about didn't exist anymore. The home I loved was gone the moment they chose Brandon's party over my wedding vows. I was no longer afraid of her judgment because I no longer respected her character. I was watching a predator try to use a wounded animal's cry to lure me into a trap, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding all the cards. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and it didn't involve a bank transfer. I was going to give them exactly what they had given me on my wedding day, a front row seat to a life they were no longer part of. My mother wasn't crying because she was losing her home. She was crying because she was afraid I had finally learned how to say no. I agreed to meet them at a bustling diner halfway between my city and their suburb, a neutral ground where the clinking of silverware and the hum of strangers would act as a barrier against their dramatics. My parents were already seated when I arrived, their faces etched with a practiced funereal gloom that vanished the moment they saw me. They didn't stand to greet me or offer a hug. Instead, my father tapped his fingers on the table, and my mother scanned my hands, her brow furrowing when she realized I wasn't carrying a checkbook. Before I could even sit down, my father let out a heavy sigh, complaining that the drive had been exhausting and that they had hoped I'd bring the funds in person to save time on the wire transfer. Their audacity was breathtaking, a seamless blend of entitlement and arrogance that made the folder in my hand feel heavier. I sat down slowly, the vinyl of the booth creaking beneath me, and placed my father's dead gold watch squarely in the center of the table. They both stared at it confused, as if they didn't even recognize the heirloom they had sent as a consolation prize for missing my wedding. Then, with the deliberate precision of a project manager presenting a final audit, I slid the printouts of the public records across the formica table. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's eyes darted across the documents, her face flushing a deep mottled red as she saw the proof that their mortgage was current and the home was safe. My father's hand shook as he reached for his coffee, realizing the bank error story had been dismantled before he could even reiterate the lie. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I spoke with the rhythmic, terrifying calmness of a judge delivering a final verdict. I told them that I knew exactly where that $30,000 was going, and it wasn't to save a house. It was to save a son who had spent his life destroying everything he touched. You missed my wedding because Brandon's birthday was family first, I said, watching my mother's jaw tighten. Well, I finally agree with you. Family does come first, and since I am the only person in this family who actually tells the truth, works for a living, and respects our legacy, I am putting myself first. I explained that I viewed the $30,000 as the exact price of my inheritance of neglect, the cost of every birthday. They forgot every milestone they ignored, and every dollar of mine they had already funneled into Brandon's bottomless pockets. The look on their faces was a mixture of shock and a sudden sharp realization that the well had finally run dry. They weren't looking at a daughter anymore. They were looking at a creditor who had just foreclosed on their emotional debt. My mother tried to stammer out a defense, claiming that I was being transactional and that love doesn't keep score, but I cut her off with a look. I told her that I had already spent the money. I had spent it on the price of their absence. I considered the books closed. Every hour I had spent fixing their lives, every vacation I had missed to bail them out, and every tear I had shed at my own altar was now paid for by my refusal to save Brandon from himself. I was done being the family's unpaid mechanic. The ultimate punishment wasn't the loss of the money itself, but the loss of the illusion that they still had power over me. They had traded a daughter who would have moved mountains for them for a son who wouldn't even change a tire for them, and now they were going to have to live with the consequences of that lopsided deal. I stood up, leaving the dead watch on the table between them, a gift returned to its rightful owners. As I walked away from the table, my mother screamed that I was cold. She didn't realize that ice is just what happens when you leave someone out in the wind for too long. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the diner were remarkably quiet, a sharp contrast to the chaotic noise that had defined my role in the family for years. The legal system, unlike my parents, did not accept excuses or sentimental appeals to family first. Without my $30,000 to grease the wheels of a private settlement, Brandon's reckless actions finally caught up with him. He was forced to face the court for his uninsured accident, resulting in a mountain of legal fees, a suspended license, and a mandatory community service sentence that he treated like a personal insult. My parents, desperate to shield their golden boy, until the very end were forced to make the sacrifices they had once tried to trick me into making. They sold their second car, dipped into their meager retirement reserves, and eventually moved into a smaller, cramped apartment to cover his debts. For the first time in their lives, they were feeling the true physical and financial weight of the son they had spent 30 years enabling. They still tried to call me, of course, but the dynamic had shifted. I had erected a permanent financial firewall around my life. I would answer the phone and talk about the weather, the books I was reading, or the garden I was planting. But the moment the conversation veered toward a temporary loan or a family emergency, I would simply say, "That sounds like something you'll have to figure out," and hang up. I was no longer their insurance policy. I was just a woman who happened to share their last name. Stepping out of the role of the strong one felt like taking off a suit of armor that had been 3 sizes too small. I had been forced into that role by their incompetence, believing that my strength was a virtue, when in reality it was just a convenience for them. Now I embraced the role of the free one. It was a choice I made every morning when I woke up in a home filled with genuine support and mutual respect. My husband and I focused on our own future, building a found family of friends and mentors who saw me for who I was, not just for what I could do for them. We spent our weekends traveling and planning for a child of our own, a child I vowed would never have to be strong just to earn a seat at the table. I realized that the architect in me was finally building something that wasn't meant to shelter people who refused to appreciate the roof over their heads. I was no longer a backup plan or a safety net. I was the main character of a life that felt vibrant, clear, and authentically mine. The guilt that I thought would haunt me never came. In its place was a profound sense of relief, the kind you feel when a chronic pain you've lived with for years suddenly vanishes. A month ago, I found myself walking past a small, high-end jewelry shop in the city. I reached into my bag and pulled out my father's gold watch, the one I had taken back from the diner table at the last second. I walked inside and handed it to the elderly jeweler, a man with steady hands and magnifying loupes perched on his forehead. He opened the back, replaced the dead battery, and cleaned the gears until they gleamed like new. When he handed it back to me, the second hand was sweeping smoothly across the face, a rhythmic, persistent ticking that felt like a heartbeat. I didn't set it to the local time. Instead, I set it to a time zone 5 hours ahead, a place I had always dreamed of visiting, but never felt I had the right to go, because I was too busy managing other people's crises. I wear that watch every day now. It no longer represents my father's neglect or the stopped time of my wedding day. Now the ticking is a constant, gentle reminder that my time is the most valuable currency I own. I will never again waste a single second of it waiting in the wings for people who are already gone, or trying to wind up a family that refuses to keep time. Standing on my balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline, I watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the skyscrapers in hues of gold and violet. I felt a deep, settled peace that I hadn't known was possible. I used to think that being a good daughter meant being a martyr, that love was measured in the amount of yourself you were willing to erase. I was wrong. Love is a bridge, and if you're the only one building it, it's not a path to connection, it's just a pier into the ocean. I am no longer building bridges to nowhere. I am focused on the solid ground beneath my feet and the people who walk beside me instead of on top of me. My parents and Brandon are still out there living in the chaos they created, but I am no longer the one holding the umbrella over their heads while I drown in the rain. I have reclaimed my story, my time, and my worth. I didn't lose a family that day at the cafe. I simply stopped being a ghost in their house, so I could finally be the queen in mine. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey of self-discovery and resilience. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of a time when you had to stand up for your own worth, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a tale of strength and justice. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you think Morgan was too cold, or was her invoice of a lifetime exactly what her family deserved after years of neglect? Many of our viewers have shared similar stories of being the strong child in a family that took them for granted, and your perspective helps us all realize that we are not alone in setting these difficult but necessary boundaries. Your engagement helps this community grow and ensures that more people hear these empowering stories of reclaiming one's life. I look forward to reading your opinions and seeing you in the next video. Thank you for watching and for being a part of this community.